It almost doesn't matter what governments do. Technology is a greater force, and technology is a greater force to lower cost or free our time. It took $185 trillion of stimulus to grow the real economy by $46 trillion. $4 of debt or leverage for every $1 of growth. Could you ever pay back that growth? And you can't. If governments today, any government today said, okay, we're going to stop printing money, what would happen? Technology is the giant change. There's nothing that is going to stop it. It's going to move faster and faster. If you priced your world in Bitcoin today, you would see what we're talking about. Everything forever will get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper in your terms.
It's strange. It's almost like this technology forces us to be the humans that we know we should be. And yet our tendencies are to always go back and cut the corners and not do the right thing. And Bitcoin is a weird technology to kind of force us to do the right thing and show up, which actually solves all of our problems for humanity.
Think about the number of people in this community that do that. Bitcoin doesn't have a marketing department. It has a whole bunch of people. Every node, it's an emergent phenomenon that as more people understand it, it gets stronger and stronger and better and more, and that brings on more and more people. And the change in our lives, because of this emergent phenomenon that is congruent with technology and where it's going, the change in our lives is so positive. I just wish more people could see it.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Jeff Booth, the entrepreneur, technologist, thought leader, and author. You have been at the forefront of technological innovation for the past 20 years and have been featured in Forbes, Bloomberg, Time Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. In 1999, you co-founded Build Direct, a $500 million first-mover technology platform for the home improvement industry. And last year, you released your first book, The Price of Tomorrow, Why Deflation is the Key to an Abundant Future, where you explain how inflation is a hidden theft that is literally stealing our wealth. You believe we need to embrace deflation and that Bitcoin can help us ensure that the abundance gained from technology reaches the widest audience possible. You've even said that Bitcoin might be the only thing that can save humanity. Jeff, welcome to London Real.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Jeff, it's great to have you here. And, you know, I had a flashback today when I was preparing for you to my early days on Wall Street. And just bear with me for a minute. I'll paint the picture. It was 1993. I was 22 years old, just graduated from MIT. And I was on this massive trading floor at Bankers Trust on the 33rd floor, about 300 alpha males and females, you know, shouting over hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses every year. And I soon learned as a young kid, Jeff, that there was one number everyone paid attention to. And they even called it the number. And I was trading in the fixed income markets. And, you know, a lot of people probably know the number I'm referring to. It was non-farm payrolls, right? It was the number of new jobs that were created that month that weren't in farming, so they couldn't be treated as cyclical. And everyone looked at this number. We were glued to it, and the markets waited for it, and then they reacted and moved because this number would tell us the growth rate, potentially the inflation rate, what the Fed would do. And it was like that moment in Trading Places, you know, where Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd are in the frozen concentrated orange juice pit, and they do all their trading, and then they wait for some old dude to read out the crop reports, and then they all go back to trading. And, you know, I got used to knowing this number. I could trade that number. I could position my portfolio. But Jeff, I never sat back and asked the simple question that you seem to have asked in your book, which is this: why is my money worth less each year? I was born into a system where we assumed that was true, and then we reacted around that. And I think most people watching us were born into that system as well. But maybe we start with that simple question. Is that where we should begin? Why is our money worth less each year?
I think so. So first off, it almost doesn't matter what governments do. Technology is a greater force, and technology is a greater force to lower cost or free our time. So what governments are facing all around the world is essentially hiding inflation, which is a hidden theft. They can't tax at the rate people would rise up against tax rates going that high. So they hide taxes and inflation, which allows them to expand governments and services that people demand out of a hidden tax. The problem with that hidden tax is it's levied on the poor part of society, the middle class and the poor, and the rich evade it because their assets go up. But it's a system problem, and why we don't ask that fundamental question is we grew up in that system. We measure every single thing that in our lives by the system that creates the problem all around us. So all of our measurement, including GDP, jobs, everything is from that system, our house prices, everything else. And so we get trapped, lulled into a false sense of security. We never ask the question, wait, does a productive society require that my money be worth less each year? And if we would ask that question, we would realize, why? That makes no sense at all. And so I think what you just did, I think that is the question. Does a productive society require that your money is worth less each year? And if that's true, who should decide? Who are you going to anoint king of the world who decides how much money or how much your money is worth less each year, or really how much you're stealing your labor rate each year or your time? Because money is just a trade of our time. And so we give our time for money and we expect to be able to use that money later on. So it's just a trade of our time. So if when you ask that question, it opens your mind to a whole bunch of things that for you can't unsee it, right? It's hard to and it takes you down a path. If that's what I thought before and that's not true, how many other things in my life might not be true too because of that fundamental miss at a base layer of money?
Right. It can lead to a real paradigm shift if you go deeper into that problem. And for people that are tuning in that might not even understand what inflation is, it's that concept you said that if I have $100 today or 100 pounds, a year from now, it's not worth that. It's worth 99 or 98 or 97, or if you're in certain countries, it's worth half of that, depending on what that inflation rate is. And it's something we've all grown accustomed to, we think is normal, and it's something we ultimately allow other people to decide. And it's almost a trick being played on us, right? It's almost an illusion.
It is an illusion. It is when you actually get to the bottom of the hole on this, you really, and you know this from my book, but over the last 20 years, this is before COVID, it took $185 trillion of stimulus to grow the real economy by 46 trillion. So essentially 4 to 1, $4 of debt or leverage for every $1 of growth. And so anyone just has to ask the simple question, could you ever pay back that growth? And you can't. And so that came in 20 years, but nobody ever connects the dots and says, what would my house be worth? My houses always rise. That's a different phenomenon. But what would my house be worth if the printing didn't happen? And then if it requires that much printing, and by the way, now it's accelerating, and it has to keep accelerating. It's just math. And so if it has to keep accelerating, do we actually live in a free market, or are all markets an illusion out of the printing? And what you find is the entire world we live in is essentially an illusion where governments are forcing prices higher of everything, food prices, energy prices, housing prices, because they have to, because the entire system collapses with deflation. So they're on a path that they have to keep on printing, otherwise the whole system resets. And if you're on the top of that ladder, if you have businesses, if you have a whole bunch of real estate, those prices are rising as a result. And if you're on the bottom of that ladder, in the middle income of that ladder, your savings are being devalued at the same rate. And so you're losing out. And then we turn to the same governments and say, redistribute wealth by creating more inflation to be able to create a whole bunch of programs to redistribute wealth when it's a system problem. And it doesn't matter who is in that system. You could vote for anybody in that system. If it requires monetary easing, and our entire inflationary policy does require forever printing and more of it, it doesn't matter who, they cannot change. There's no vote that you could make that could change that system. It's a system problem. So there's a whole bunch of good and bad people, mostly good, but caught in a system that they don't understand, that there's no way out of it. And so if you went to what I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit, but that means, and if you look at what happens with technology, is the incumbent rarely sees the change that's coming. A change is imposed by a technology that produces far better benefits for society, and society starts using the new change. And what the incumbent does typically is tries to block the change. And they make it worse by blocking the change. So if you look at Blockbuster in the US adding candy aisles to their stores, and we laugh now, because Netflix essentially made the stores redundant. It was useless. You didn't need a store because download speeds changed and you could download a movie instantly. So that's typical in business. And what we're finding is that pattern is actually happening at the monetary level. What's happening at the entire monetary level all around the world is the existing system will break down. It will fail. There's a whole bunch of things we could talk about on the cascade towards there. Monetary easing, concentration of all power in government on that path, and a reduction of individual rights and freedoms along that path. You can talk about all of that, which will happen for sure, as Bitcoin is a different system. It's a network transfer of value that is an escape valve from that system.
This is powerful stuff, and I definitely want to get to the Bitcoin implications. You published your book pre-COVID, and then you got to watch all of this happen right in front of your face, Jeff, as you just talked about what happened for the previous 20 years with all the printing, and then you saw a record amount of printing happen in the last year. I think it's like 400 or 500 billion. What was it like for you to watch this happen in real time, to see a crisis, and then to see more money being printed on the back of it? What did you note from how the government reacted, how the public reacted, and then did anyone realize that they were being inflated, their assets at the end of the day?
I think more and more people are waking up to the fact every day, but still caught in a system. And then when you're caught in a system and you don't feel like you have any power over that system, you might scream at the system, you might march in the street at the system, but then you go back into your job and you go back into the world and you live in that system. And there's not much you can do. And so funny, and a lot of people, because I wrote that book prior to COVID, prior to all of this, and it's just played out. Everything has just been like it's like you could see the future. A lot of people call me, they think I have a time machine, but it's not a time machine. It's just, if you understand the patterns in one system that must keep increasing, it must keep monetizing, must drive inflation, because you couldn't pay back the debt in real terms. So you have to drive inflation, and the number has to keep going up and up. And what that does to society, it makes a whole bunch of people poor, and it makes some very small people wealthy. And those wealthy people have access to government. So they stay on top, and and the businesses that benefit from it too. It's all feeds back on itself. Predictable. You can predict all of the next steps, and it's pretty easy to predict what had to happen. And so what's happened is it's played out exactly. I didn't predict COVID, but virtually every other thing is predicted in the book, and all the next steps are predicted too.
right? It's like in the playbook. You know, I'm having some flashbacks to guests that have been in the studio, and I remember having conversations with people last year when we saw governments send out checks, government print money to prop up equity markets. And I remember having conversations with people and saying, you think this is what you want. You think you want a check from the government, but you're going to pay for this 10 times over, especially as one of the lower income people, especially as someone that doesn't own assets. And yet it was very difficult for people to connect with that. On the same note, I've had guests in here like Robert Kiyosaki, who says, Brian, poor people work for money, rich people make money work for them, which illustrates that if you own assets, at least you can be on the winning side of that temporary situation, right? You can, again, win by owning those businesses, better taxation, not hit the inflationary hit as much as someone with savings. But you go on to say the rich get richer until they don't, because ultimately that leads to overthrows of governments, massive changes in power, seizures of assets. So even the people, the 1%ers who look like they're winning, you would argue that this system is flawed for everyone in the long enough time.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm really glad you pointed that out. I wrote an entire chapter in the book called Us versus Them, that talks about how do you manipulate other people against others. And when a giant part of the population looks at a very small group of people that has everything and they don't, look through history at what happens. And so it's easy to see what's coming next, and it's easy to see those people. So I totally understand, because I understand human nature so well as well, evolutionary biology, everything else. I understand how our minds they change all the time, and we think, but so you have to really have empathy to put yourself into somebody else's position that is at the bottom of the ladder or the middle of that ladder, and they don't know what's happening. And some new leader comes and says, it's those people's fault, and I'm gonna take it all from them and cause it. That's how those people get elected, by creating society that turns society against each other. And because it's a foundational problem, because it's a structural problem instead of a people problem, those people essentially concentrate control of everything as they do that. And you have to create a bigger enemy that's outside of your borders to retain power. And so if you look at currency, and here's what happened historically. Historically, you would see these currency resets, call it 80 to 120 years. And you'd have a long debt cycle, essentially, and a war would reset that. And the winner of the war would say, now here's the currency, promise we won't do it again. And then do it again over and over. And then because your population is demanding more services, and the easiest way to give them more services without telling them they're picking their pocket to give them more services is to hide it in inflation. So you can control a population by giving them exactly what they want by picking their pocket and not telling them. And it gets way on itself, and then every currency around the world does the same thing, and they're all playing the game theory, racing to the bottom. Essentially, if you looked at inflation, it's also wage deflation. So you're creating lower cost labor to try to keep jobs while technology is removing them and saving your time. So you're creating a society where you're creating modern day slavery out of society. And that's what, but these things typically reset every 80 to 120 years. And then the winner of the war kind of, here's the new currency regime. You look at Bretton Woods out of World War II, and here's the way this is going to set for the next system.
Right.
And Bretton Woods effectively ended in 71 when US went off the gold reserve and pushed their pain because they couldn't fund US taxes at that time were in the 60s were about 90%. They couldn't fund their liabilities. And so France demanded their gold back in return, and US went off the gold reserve and pushed that pain around the world. And now you had a whole bunch of, and then the next trick, essentially parlor trick, was to price their dollars in oil. And so the entire oil complex is actually pricing energy in US dollars, that every other country had to play on that game to be able to energy. And what it did for the US is it gave them a massive advantage because their energy was effectively free.
Right. Because they can set the price themselves by setting the dollars.
Then they could print more money and make the energy free.
The fascinating part about this is that right now here in the UK, there's something called universal credit, and it's basically money given out to certain income levels, and they increased it during COVID to an additional £20 a week, and now they're talking about stopping it, because all of the those issues are now over, and yet it's the lower income people that are fighting tooth and nail to keep the subsidies going that ultimately deflate their wages, right? Ultimately hurt them in the long run. And yet, as you said in your book, they're caught up in a system where they're making the worst choices for themselves, trying to fight for those or even more, social repairs or more distribution that's ultimately going to end in more pain for them and then a failure of the system.
So when we're and think about, I wrote about this, when it's easy to question it's going to be not easy to question your own privilege and status, where you grew up, what you have, and the reason you have those things. But imagine it on the other side. So imagine you don't know you have access to unlimited education because education is free today, because internet's free today. You don't know you have all of this. You don't, you're stuck in a loop, because that positive reinforcement for the wealthy is a negative reinforcement for the middle class and poor. And the kids can't get into the schools, and so they're stuck into working harder and harder and harder, 2 jobs to be able to pay the bills, and they don't know how to anymore. And now you take away, and they don't have savings. And so that what ends up happening in our brains is, if we feel fear, we shut down all possibility. We don't think about abundance. Our animal brain, our prehistoric brain takes over, and we think about, I can't get eaten by the lion. It's a fear response, and so it makes you less intelligent, or unable to see a whole bunch of possibilities. So if you think about how many people live in that fear today, it's a perfectly understandable response that they would race to. I get that it's hurting them more, but it's perfectly understandable why they do that. And why it's so easy to control a population through concentrating all power in government when you do that, and why a dictator always gets elected and then takes control and changes individual rights and freedoms and concentrates more power in the state. It's because it's history. If you look through history, it's a really easy path to see. It always happens that way. And it happens because the masses will trust anyone that will tell them it'll look different.
Yeah. I spent 6 months of this year running to be the next mayor of London, and it was my crash course in politics. And, Jeff, it was very sobering, because, my brain went in and tried to solve the major problems this city faces, which I think are the same problems every other city. It's crime, it's transportation. We were having, obviously, lockdowns because of business, so that was a real issue as well, and housing. And we came up with all these creative solutions. I tapped into a bunch of really smart people in the city. And I remember I was on one Zoom call and I said to everybody, if we do everything we want to do, we won't get credit. 2 mayors from now will get credit, because these things will take 10 or 15 years. And I said, is everybody okay with that? And they said, yes, because we see what happens now. The only way to get elected is to give this short-term gains, and it's never to make those real changes, because people don't really want to hear that. And it's hard to even fathom that. And what you're really thinking about is what's happening to me right now. And like you said, that fear impulse is very real. And even though there is an abundance of information and education, you have a prison in your own brain to a certain extent. And so, yeah, I learned really quickly that none of these ideas made a difference. They didn't get people's attention. And I don't know how anyone would get elected to work on those longer term solutions with the short term pain. So that cycle in itself is maybe perpetuates some of this. But again, the system, I think, is the core issue.
Well, that's what you have. You have misinformation and money. And when misinformation exists in money and an incentive system, the entire incentive system is to create more misinformation, then misinformation must grow at that rate that misinformation and money grows everywhere in society. And that's what's happening. So if anybody's trying to get elected from the system using the same economic model, inflationary economic model, that misinformation must be prevalent everywhere, and it must exponentially grow everywhere in society. That's what we're facing.
What's an example of misinformation exponentially growing?
So I think people would see it every. So I'll take you to a piece in my book where I said our intelligence is error correction. Intelligence is error correction. And so I'll use an example in the printing press. It created a whole bunch more information. And that information used to be centrally controlled in the church. And king or church and a co-op and everybody else had to listen to that information. And it was based on and very few people had other information. So when you had a printing press that reduced the cost of knowledge, so people could contribute to that and distribute that knowledge everywhere, you had an explosion of knowledge. And then that knowledge created a whole bunch of misinformation as well. Other religions, all trying to essentially create power their own way, and a whole bunch of science and as well. And the best ideas win over time because that information could now be written and other people could error correct that information. And if you think about what we live on is that information expanding and being error corrected, and the best ideas cut through that information, and they live on. Fair?
Yeah.
Now think about a technology that's 100,000 million times more powerful than the printing press and lowering the cost of information, and has made us all be able to contribute our own information. And money is breaking down in itself and printing more money, which is causing a whole bunch. And so all of that, there's a bunch of misinformation in that as well. And the best signal is cutting through that. And it's catching its own. It doesn't need a government to say Bitcoin. So you have a whole bunch of misinformation in the system getting worse and worse and worse. And the technology has also created a way for all minds to contribute to something that could look very different. Now, what will happen on the backside of this is artificial intelligence will error correct that as well, because we won't be able to, our minds aren't capable to do that error correcting at this scale. But that's what's happening today. It's just such a change from what we've lived through in information processing and everything else compared to where this is going. And if then you're changing money or time, money, think about money just as trade. It's an arbitrary concept. All it is a trade of our time. We don't want more money. We want what we think more money will gain us. We want more time.
Yeah, that's the powerful realization right there. And so, say, for example, the internet hadn't come along and hadn't been adopted, we were already facing a crisis with what we were doing with our monetary policy. But now you have this technology that's growing at an exponential rate that we can't even conceive, that is now dropping the price of everything. And that now compounds on the issue we're sitting with right now. And we can't see that coming because we don't humanly understand what exponential change means. Is that another point you're making, that we need to try?
Yeah, and you know from the book again, but if you fold a piece of paper on itself 50 times, that piece of paper will reach the sun. Now, for people that are just hearing that for the first time on your show, I know they're going to Google it and everything else, but because what ends up happening is on the first number of folds, it's really thin. And it's the same thing that we misunderstand how fast technology is. You have an exponential pattern in technology that's moving at that rate, doubling every 18 months to 2 years, that is moving at that rate. And when you're in the thin folds of the piece of paper, fold 1, fold 2, fold 3, there's in technology, people think, wow, this is going to change the world, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't move the needle. But when you're in the thick folds, fold 34, 35, 36, the steps are so big we can't even comprehend it. And so look around the world today and look at your phone and look at self-driving cars coming and everything else. And these are just the tip of the iceberg of what's coming. Very tip. You can't even comprehend what's coming. And these things, how can it be, if you look on your phone, photography, music, everything's free. Think about what it cost to do those things 20 years ago. How can it not be at that rate of everything free that prices aren't coming down everywhere? And if you forecast that forward, the deflation has just started. Most of it's in front of us. And so you have one path wanting to free our time and make our time worth more, essentially, as jobs come out of the market, prices fall in lockstep, and you have a system that will not allow it going the other way. And so this system has to offset the rate at which technology is making your time more valuable, and concentrate all wealth by doing that and printing money. So instead of you freeing your time, you become a modern day slave to whoever is in control of the money printing. And that's what those two paths have to keep going like this, because this system. So now, but let's just ask a serious question. If governments today, any government today said, okay, we're going to stop printing money, what would happen?
Yeah, this is the great question. That's why I wanted to have you on, because everyone criticizes the printing of money last year during the pandemic, but no one entertains what would happen if you didn't. So what happens? I see mayhem.
You have so the money that people think is there isn't there. It's a counterparty risk. And in 2008, my business had letters of credit all around the globe, and counterparty banks wouldn't take the money because they thought our bank would fail. Tier 1, number 1 bank in Canada, we had tons of money in the bank. Other banks, the banking institute, our money because they thought that our bank would fail. And so what you have, if you have housing prices starting to fall globally, if you have anything starting to fall globally, which technology requires, then the entire system, the money that people think is there, isn't there. It just keeps it cascades, and it's a debt spiral. It's an unwind of that leverage, which is so monumental today. And that leverage is our life today. Everything's in it. Our institutions, our hospitals, our governments, everything, our banks. There is no money there if you let so that deflationary spiral. And it's because governments didn't catch this, just like technology, just like a normal business like Sears wouldn't see Amazon. They didn't see it early enough. And so they kept on that pace, and technology is going the other way. And now it's too late. So now if you let that credit collapse, there would be mayhem. It would absolutely mayhem. There would be a collapse of everything. And so
how does that play out? Have you thought through like what happens in the first day, the 7 days, the 1 month? I mean, I'm not trying to get macabre on you, but
there's no food on their shelves. You have riots. You have complete chaos. You have energy fails. You can see what. By the way, those things are coming in a different form, anyways. Unfortunately, winter's coming. I wish that wasn't true, but those things are coming anyways. It's going to come. It's likely comes in a different form. But that's what it would look like if government stopped printing today. You would have a complete credit unwind of the world, and then society would race to the people that said, either through force or through, I'm going to change it. So you just have a consolidation of power in a different form if you had allowed an unwind today. And that's actually what is so critical about this. And it'll get into Bitcoin. From this system, unless you want revolution, war, reset global, and we've never been through a debt reset like this, our entire global debt reset with the technology we have to kill ourselves like today, and what's coming. So we've never seen what that could look like. When I said I think it Bitcoin could be the possible only way humanity survives. It's not hyperbole. It's if you think about that path and what must happen on that path, it gets pretty grim on that path. And imagine it doesn't get grim. Imagine somehow governments could keep doing that. The only way they're doing it is by concentrating all control in government and destroying the free market. And so remember, government is it's no more than you or me or anybody else. It's a collection of people. And so who should have that type of domain over other people? And I don't think anybody should have that domain over other people, because if you understand where artificial intelligence is going, or robotics, think about Boston Robotics 10 years ago. Go look at the videos 10 years ago, look at it today, and think about AI moving at that same rate, and think about what it would look like. Who owns that control? Who is the one person, who would you trust to have that control over other human beings, and who would rise up against that control? We don't, if you look at dictator states and everything else, very few people rise up because they get killed. What would happen if governments are able to concentrate all wealth into very few hands and pretend that they're doing it to help people? I'm not willing to trust my kid's life to that path, because people change their minds. We see it all the time. Narcissism, whole bunch of somebody believes that they should have that much power, and power corrupts. Absolutely, absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. So,
is China a future version of us, because the government has to lock down more, and then it ultimately fails, just like the Western system? Or is it just a parallel universe right now?
That's what's happening. If you look to China, if you look what's happening in China, if you want to live in that society, a lot of people misunderstand China's growth, and they think it was the unbelievable free market society. It wasn't. You've never had a country grow their debt to GDP faster than China. So you have essentially, and it's concentration of control. And now what has to happen is they have to, through force, control society through any means, through artificial intelligence, through social credit, through kind of changing what they think by controlling TikTok and a whole bunch. They have to control society.
So that potentially is a future version of us right now in the Western world, before that ultimately collapses in a revolution. But this time, like you said, it's a global revolution with a massive debt reset we've never seen. On top of that, technology we can't handle from an arms standpoint of view, or just it's the technology itself from AI, and you're looking at a massive disaster.
Massive disaster.
Now, Bitcoin is something I want to talk about now. If we hadn't seen this technology invented, when would this scenario play out, do you think? I mean, do you think this is something you would see in your lifetime, your children's lifetime?
The scenario we're talking about now?
But, yeah, let's just talk about this scenario. So assume that we didn't have potentially a Bitcoin to come in and provide an alternative. I mean, just based on what you're telling me, it's just only a matter of time, and it's growing exponentially.
And that's what's really important to note before we get to that, but I'll get to that in a second. If you believe that technology is supposed to save your time, and technology is moving exponentially, and then that means that technology gets cheaper and cheaper, and you get more for less forever. It just keeps on running in price. If you believe that technology is going to slow down, then maybe we could go on forever. if you don't believe that, if you believe the technology and look around what's happening with technology, if you believe technology is actually speeding up or growing exponentially and what that could do to be able to get us out of being work slaves for our time, then you can see these systems are feeding back faster and faster. So technology is the giant change that there's nothing that is going to stop it. It's going to move faster and faster. And so how fast would this happen, what we're talking about, this reset without Bitcoin? It's probably 2 years away, 3 years away without Bitcoin. It gets really bad.
That soon? I thought you were going to say 10 or 20 or 30.
And this is something, and I got to be careful here because I might you can easily miss by a cycle with how fast technology is moving, or something changes, or somebody gets but if you look around the world today and you see the signposts that it's okay to have Khashoggi cut up with bone saws, and if you look at what's happening in China, if you look around the world, all over the world, and just look at these signposts, they're all accelerating. If you look at the marches on the street in cities that don't get covered by the news, if you think about what's happening, all of these things are accelerating at a pace, and it's accelerating because that has to happen.
Right.
So, but I might miss, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 7 years, but if I had to say, this system, it becomes, here's what people do, unfortunately do. It's like asking, when they're looking for the event that triggers it, it's like asking which snowflake caused the avalanche. When you're building more and more instability into the system, you can guarantee it fails spectacularly, but you can't tell when or how.
Yeah. And again, it just makes sense. I mean, from a numbers standpoint, from the exponential standpoint, and again, look at, like you said, Boston Dynamics, look at what they were creating, what they're now creating. This is stuff they're showing us. And then look at some of the things we see in China that we know about with the social scores and all of that, that video technology with AI and 5G, where it's just, and then what's the likelihood of a revolt or that happening? And then when it does happen, it gets really ugly, really fast. And we haven't really seen it at a global scope. We saw World War II, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is a global reset and global mayhem that would probably make that look like a tiny blip.
Yeah, that's what I worry about. That's exactly what I worry. In fact, the reason I wrote my book, and this, the reason I wrote my book is I looked out at the system and what the system must do, and I looked at my kids and I said they're not going to grow up in the same world I grew up in, and that's not because of we don't have the technology to make the world people have abundance today. It's not because of that. It's because of fear, greed, and living in a system that people can't see a different system could produce way better results. And so it's not through the lack of ability. It's because people are so scared of because that system is so unknown to them. A lot of people will listen to the show and say, yeah, totally get it. Technology is supposed to free our time. We don't dig holes with with spoons anymore. We could, and what does that mean? And then go back to live in and not question anything else and reinforce the existing world. I think a lot about this, and this is our entire world is actually everything we experience was an idea first. The system that we've designed was an idea. This was an idea. Remember, before this idea, there was a different idea that reigned supreme. It was you had to have a keyboard on your phone, and it was BlackBerry. It was a Canadian company.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.